chapter 29, section 5. So by the time you get to the middle 1500s, what you've got is this. Northern Europe is pretty much Protestant, and Southern Europe is pretty much Catholic. You were kind of expected to follow the religion of your leader. And if you refused, you could be persecuted for it. And so now you're going to start seeing a period where you're going to have religious wars between countries begin. And so let's start off talking England versus Spain. So we've already mentioned England was under Elizabeth I. It's going to become a very leading Protestant power in Europe. Spain was still under Philip II, and they were a leading Catholic power in Europe. Well, Philip II wants to defeat England, and so he is going to build an armada, this large group of warships. Takes him 2 years to build this armada, 130 ships, and the ships were galleons. These were heavy ships with square sails, long raised decks. And in 1588, this armada, this Spanish armada, is going to sail towards England. It's supposed to help the army cross to England across the Channel. Okay, because that's the thing about England. To get to England, you had to go by sea. You couldn't just march an army there because it's an island. The thing is, Elizabeth was ready for them. She ordered, when she heard about the armada being built, she ordered the English fleet to be remodeled. They had 134 ships, but they were mostly smaller. They didn't have large guns, but they had more guns. And they had expert sailors like Sir Francis Drake. The English needed to break the Spanish formation. Okay, the Spanish galleons altogether were a strong factor to be dealt with. And so the English, Drake, they're going to send 8 small ships. They're going to set them on fire, and they're going to send them into the armada. Well, the armada has to scatter because the armada, those are wooden ships. You couldn't get run into by one of these ships that were on fire. When the armada scatters, that breaks the armada apart. And so now the English could fight the Spanish ships one-on-one. The armada ends up going back to Spain, and on their way back, there's a huge storm, and only about half of the armada actually made it back to Spain. This shows Europe. The English weren't a pushover. England was a force to be reckoned with. If you look at France in the 1500s, most of the people of France were Catholic. But the nobles, the lawyers, the doctors, the merchants, they were Protestant. They're actually what's called Huguenots. These were French Protestants that followed John Calvin. In 1534, King Francis I, a Catholic, okay, is going to forbid the Huguenots from worshiping. And he warns all the French that they better be Catholic. Well, by 1562, you're going to end up with a civil war. The Huguenots versus the Catholics. The new king by then is going to be Charles IX. Well, he was too young to rule on his own. And so actually the person that rules is going to be his mom, Catherine de' Medici. Okay, we talked in the Renaissance about the Medici family. Catherine tries to keep the peace. In the end, she supports the Catholics. In 1572, Catherine allows Catholic nobles to kill the leading Huguenots in Paris. When this happens, violence against Protestants break out in other parts of France as well. Henry of Navarre, he led the Huguenots. Okay, in 1589, the king was killed, and so Henry of Navarre becomes Henry IV, the new ruler of France. He wants peace, and actually, even though he was the lead of the Huguenots before, he converts to Catholic. Since most of the French were Catholic, he figures that was a way to peace. And he is going to make Catholicism the national religion. But he also eased life for the Protestants. He wasn't out to persecute them. He wanted peace. So in 1598, he issues the Edict of Nantes. Huguenots will now have the freedom of worship. The French were going to be the first European nation to allow two Christian denominations. You had Protestants and you had Catholics. If we go to the Low Countries, at the time they were called the Low Countries. Today, it's where Belgium and Netherlands are. Okay, at the time they were called the Low Countries. The Low Countries were actually part of the Spanish Empire, but they were divided. They were divided into Protestant and Catholic. But the thing is, neither of them liked Philip II of Spain. You know, he taxed them really heavy. His laws were harsh on them. You know, Philip wanted to keep the Low Countries under Spanish control. You know, there was a lot of money and trade that came from the Low Countries. So Philip is going to set up something called the Inquisition to get rid of Protestantism, the Spanish Inquisition. Well, in 1567, the Protestants revolt. And this is not going to be a short revolt. They begin revolting in 1567. The revolt lasts until 1648. What it ends up doing, it ends up splitting up the Low Countries. Okay? To the south, you ended up with Belgium. Well, this was Catholic. It was under Spanish rule. To the north, you ended up with Netherlands. They were Protestant, and they were independent. They weren't under Catholic rule. So in this Reformation chapter, we got one last section we're going to talk about here, chapter 29, section 6. And the main thing we're going to talk about in chapter 29, section 6 is going to be the 30 Years' War. So the Germans were fighting over the terms of the Peace of Augsburg. Remember, that was a thing that allowed Catholics and Protestants to exist. And you're going to end up with alliances forming based on religion. So Ferdinand II is going to lead a Catholic alliance. Well, an area called Bohemia is going to resist Ferdinand. And so the Protestants in Bohemia in 1618 are going to revolt. The thing is, Ferdinand crushes the Bohemians, and he claimed that he is king of the Bohemians now, and Protestantism will not be allowed. And Jesuits were actually going to be sent in to Bohemia to win the people back to the Catholic Church. Well, it ends up that half of Europe's armies are going to fight in Germany. Denmark and Sweden invade Germany, trying to stop Catholicism. Well, the Swedes are defeated, and then the French join in. And the French, they were a Catholic nation, but they fought on the side of the Protestants. So this kind of shows that even though the 30 years war might have started off as something with religious war ideals, when the Catholics of France fight on the side of the Protestants in this war, this shows it's less of a religious war. It's more about wanting territory and money. In 1643, the German emperor is going to ask for peace. And so in 1648, they come up with the Peace of Westphalia. This ended the war. And according to this peace, the German emperor lost a lot of power. But the French prove that they're strong again. And this really ends the religious wars. And now when you saw fighting, it was more about fighting for power and fighting for territory and less about religious conversion.